We ended the last lecture in a bit of a rhetorical twilight zone, an intellectual cul-de-sac. We followed Moore through his analysis, noting that his analysis seems to support or produce a principle that assertions of the form, here's a hand, or here's a cockroach, or here's a soap bubble, have an implication that something exists outside us, i.e. that a physical object, a external world object, can be inferred from those assertions. That principle isn't actually mentioned in the performative version of the proof, and that should be troubling to us. Why doesn't he have that premise explicitly there? In his defense of the proof, he asserts that he knows those statements. Here's a hand. I know that, he says. Here's another hand. I know that. And so he seems to be claiming that he's got a proof that establishes an external world and that it exists. The premises of that proof are known to him, and yet he doesn't know that there's an external world. Now, how do we make sense of that? How do we understand the epistemic status, both of the explicit premises and that unstated principle that seemed to be operative in his proof? And how can we make sense of their epistemic status in light of his seeming admission that he can't satisfy the skeptic with regard to his knowledge, though he claims to have it? A similar difficulty or troubling feature has emerged when we look at the proof as well. When Descartes sets out to reconstruct his knowledge edifice, we noted that at the end of the Meditations, he's got a pretty anemic knowledge edifice. He doesn't actually seem to know very much according to his own standards, even if he is successful. And when Moore tells us he's going to give us a proof of the external world, it kind of leads us to expect that that proof is going to give us something that is a little more robust than two objects have existed in the past. They existed when I proved them, and that's about it. So his proof of an external world isn't the sort of external world that we would hope to get. What we were hoping to get was something like, I can prove the existence of an external world that has the same basic features that we suppose that it did before the skeptical challenge. And Moore just doesn't seem to have that on offer with his proof, even if we accept that his proof is successful, which it's not clear that it is. So our question now is, how can we make sense of Moore's proof in a way that doesn't render it merely circular or trivial or disingenuous? I think a good first step is to try and understand how it is that we think Moore's philosophical methodology is supposed to operate. And what I'm going to suggest here is that Moore seems to be assuming, as part of his general methodology, that the structure and commitments of common sense or ordinary language, or common sense is expressed through our use of ordinary language, something like that. The structure and commitments that are involved in that activity provide us with the basic justifications for the implications that they license. And so when we understand the terms and phrases and their proper uses in ordinary language consistent with common sense, when they are relatively free of ambiguity and vagueness, it seems like Moore supposes then they provide us with warranted epistemic insights into the nature of reality. But if that's the case, why does Moore seem to demur in the face of the skeptical challenge? The answer here seems to be that his assumption is that the skeptic is in fact challenging those basic assumptions about the structure and commitments that underlie common sense as it's expressed in ordinary language or in our use of ordinary language, so that the skeptic is challenging the very source of his epistemic warrant, and he doesn't have a response to that challenge, even though he thinks that he knows that it's wrong. That at least renders what he says relatively consistent in the context. Let's see if we can get some reflective insight into the project overall. When we think about Moore's analysis, one of the things that we need to note is that it seems to reveal this principle, this relationship between those assertions that are part of the performative proof and the conclusion that is part of the performative proof. But that principle itself isn't actually in the proof, even though it seems to clearly function and be necessary for the proof to actually work. So the fact that the principle is not part of the performative proof, if we're charitable, we'll call that a lapse on his part. The performative premises of the proof also seem unjustified. And if we are uncharitable with Moore and we say, look, that principle that you have extracted through your analysis, that isn't justified. And moreover, your assertion that here's a hand, here's another hand, that doesn't seem justified either. And so we can question the epistemic merit of every premise in your proof. And I think this is what he in fact thinks that the skeptic does. They question the source of the epistemic status of the premises that are explicit in the performative proof, as well as the underlying principle that is omitted from the performative proof. They seem to question the source of that epistemic status in a way that Moore doesn't and acknowledges that they do. And this puts us in a strange situation, because if that's how we understand Moore, and it seems like the only way I can understand Moore, that doesn't make him seem trivial or disingenuous. Then it seems Moore has this odd choice. Moore seems to either be committed to this notion that inference doesn't transfer justification. That is, I can know these premises. I can make this valid deductive argument based on these known premises to the conclusion that there's an external world. But that conclusion isn't justified. And that seems to be the implications of his explicit statements in that larger defense of the proof. He also, though, says things that suggest that he knows, even though he doesn't have explicit justification. And so again, I think the way in which he can retreat is to claim that he's making these assumptions about common sense, ordinary language, or the use of ordinary language as informed by common sense and what it gives to us, so that the implications that it introduces are in fact as epistemically warranted as anything else, and acknowledges that those assumptions are assumptions that would be denied or challenged by the skeptic. But the interesting thing for us, I think, is that Moore doesn't successfully establish any new method for introducing uncontroversially epistemic status into the belief edifice. And he also seems to introduce a certain amount of doubt that we see Russell also expressing, and that we see Gettier becoming famous by explicitly calling attention to, namely that our assumptions that justification is transferred through successful inference in this unproblematic and exceptionalist fashion is maybe not such a safe assumption after all. And if that's the case, now we have worries about the source of the original epistemic justification in our belief edifice, and this mechanism by which that justification can percolate through to other beliefs in the knowledge edifice. We'll pick that up, look at it in great detail when we turn our attention to Gettier.